Turn with me to the book of Hebrews and chapter 1. Deanne kindly read for us. We'll be looking at that chapter this morning. So, there's a world of difference between starting and finishing. There's a world of difference between starting well and finishing well. I guess we all know that in personal experience. You start a job, maybe the house or the garden. In a little while, the whole place looks as if a bomb's hit it. And you're thinking, why did I bother? Why on earth did I bother? Can someone please just remind me why I started this? Well, it's a little bit like the people that the book of Hebrews was written to. They started well, but then they wondered why exactly it was they'd started at all. Just so we clear the hurdle, who wrote the book of Hebrews? Well, the answer is very, very simple. We don't know, so please get over it. In honesty, what is the point of looking into something where we don't know? If God hasn't told us, clearly it's not important. So move on. Who was Hebrews written to? Well, now that starts to get a little more interesting. And the writer gives us many glimpses through the letter, and those glimpses put the letter into real-world experience of you and me. So these were not newbie Christians. They were been Christians for some while, and they had started well. So we look over to chapter 10 and verse 32. The writer says, "Remember those earlier days after you'd received the light." So when you'd first become a Christian. It was earlier days. It was a while ago. They weren't newbies. He says, "Remember those earlier days when you endured in a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions." They started well. See, when you first become a Christian, everything's new and it's fresh. And it's so real, it's as if you can reach out and touch it. Nothing else compares. Nothing else compares. But starting and finishing are two very different things. And from the many warnings that are contained in this letter of Hebrews, it's clear that the folk here had become discouraged to the point of thinking about giving up. See, the freshness of becoming a Christian fades. Reality drifts into ritual. And instead of hearing new things, you're kind of hearing things you kind of know it all already. And besides which, the preacher's a bit boring, so actually, wonder how long he'll go on for. And the things that were once so crystal clear and so certain become doubt and question. And sometimes you become full of doubts and fears. And sadly, some drift away and some turn their back on what they once believed. We're not very good at being honest. We're not very good at knowing how to deal with people who are honest. You're supposed to be on fire for the Lord all the time. You're not? Well, headmaster's office for a detention, please. And you quickly learn to put on the Sunday smile. I'm fine. When underneath, at times, everything is falling apart. Well, here, things were falling apart to the extent that they were considering throwing in the towel and going back to what they once were. See, for example, chapter 10, verse 35, he says to them, "Don't throw away your confidence. Don't throw in the towel," he says. And maybe for someone here this morning, it's a bit like that. Maybe discouragement set in, and you're sort of asking, well, is it really all worth it? There are times when I've felt questions like that in my Christian life over many years. There are times when you feel discouragement and you ask the questions and things are not that straightforward. So as you saw with Stuart last week, the writer of the Hebrews urges these Christians, and he urges you and me, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. So when things are going well, that sounds great, doesn't it? And we quote the words of that famous chorus, "Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face. What does that really mean? And Monday morning, what does that mean? When the howling and chilling winds of doubt and fear are blowing round you, when discouragement is eating away at your inside like a cancer, when perhaps your family is telling you that your Christianity is outdated, that the things that you practice are out of touch with a modern society, that your Jesus has got no relevance to life today, when you're the only one, your family and your workplace, and you feel like giving up, what does it really mean? Well, the writer of the Hebrews is going to tell us what it really means. And so let's look at what he says. He starts with a bang in chapter 1. And I want to look at three things from it. And firstly, I want to see from this God's final word. God's final word, and we're looking at the first three verses. So the final word. I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, and no doubt we've all been in discussion where we've tried to be the one who has the final word and tops somebody else. It's the last point, or it's the last opinion expressed in some sort of argument or discussion or debate. The one that seeks to stick in your mind, that tries to override or summarise what's been said before. Especially if it's decisive or conclusive. It ends the discussion and the debate. There's nothing more to add. And often we use the phrase when someone has the final authority to decide what happens or how something happens. We'll debate it, but at the end of the day, I retain the right to have the final word. We see all those things here in the book of Hebrews. So it's God's final word because it comes at the end of a long line of prophets. God's final word now ends the revelation of the prophets. He says in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. This is what it all looked forward to. Everything before was just the kind of workup. It was the trailer. It was the build-up. With the coming of Jesus, here is the ultimate fulfillment of everything that the prophets look forward to. Here is the reason for everything that went before the coming of Jesus and what he would do. You can't deny the existence of Jesus. Jesus isn't some sort of Santa Claus figure embellished with time and tradition. History attests his life. It attests his birth, his life, his death, his resurrection. The question is, what are you going to make of him? What are you going to make of him? The writer tells us he is God's final word. All the revelation of the prophets, all the predictions that they made, all the promises that they foretold are fulfilled in the coming of Jesus Christ. So what do you make of him? And what are you going to make of his claims on your life this morning? But this is also God's final word because it is God's ultimate revelation of himself. You see, all the Old Testament was ultimately a revelation of God and his character and his purposes. See, as the prophecies were added, as our writer says, as the prophets spoke at many times and in various ways, so the character and the purposes of God become clearer. But now, as the understanding is clearer, he says in these last days, he's given his ultimate revelation through his Son. And so the writer says in verse 3, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. In other words, God reveals himself in the person of Jesus Christ. The language used here is like the stamping of an image on a coin. So you stamp the image on the coin, and the image is the exact representation of the stamp. Or the word literally has the idea of an engraving tool. So it's like an engraving on an object that is permanently engraved into it. And so you see that with Jesus, God's character, his very essence, is so stamped upon him. It is so etched into his character that to see Jesus is to see God. It's not that he has God-like qualities. He is the God-man, fully human, fully divine. He is God's ultimate revelation of himself. God just hasn't sent a message through a prophet. God himself has walked amongst us. One of our paraphrases sums up the meaning of verse 3 quite well when it says, "The Son radiates God's own glory and expresses the very character of God." God has walked amongst us. God has given us his ultimate revelation of himself. He came into a broken world. So what are you going to make of his final words? But this is also God's final word in that he retains the authority to decide what happens. He overrules everything else. So you see in verse 2, he says about his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. And he says, after saying that he reveals God, he says he is sustaining all things by his powerful words. See, Jesus didn't just come to deliver a message like a town crier or the prophets of old. He came into the world that he had made, which he sustains by his powerful world, which is his by right. He is creation's king. He walks amongst the creation that he holds in his hand. As you look out in 2025 into the world in its brokenness and its mess, God has the final word. God rules all things through his Son. Everything is in his hands. But this is also God's final word, because Jesus has now sat down at the right hand of God. It says at the end of verse 3, after he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. In other words, God has nothing further to add. He has spoken his final word and now is complete. He spoke through his Son, and his Son has now sat down to indicate a completed task. It's done, he says. It's finished. He has sat down. Now, we probably missed the point here, but part of what he's telling us is that there is now a man in heaven sat down at the right hand of God. Why is that significant? We remember Adam, the Garden of Eden, how he'd been shut out. Paradise was lost. And the way back was guarded by the angel. So there was no way that Adam could go back to what he had lost. And however hard we try, the effects of the fall are there. There is no way back. The brokenness, the frustrations, the disaster, the sickness, ultimately death. It's our lot. But most of all, Adam was shut out from the presence of God. And so too you and me, shut out from that knowledge of God. But now the second Adam sits at God's right hand. The perfect God-man has brought paradise regained. I no longer need to fear death. All is complete. He sits down at God's right hand. God has given his final words. Now, I'm not a betting man, and the Bible doesn't condone betting in any way. But just for the illustration, supposing you knew which race was going to win next weekend. You knew which horse would win, which horse to back. What would you put on it? Would you bet a fiver? Perhaps you might put a tenner on it. Now, this is for definite. You know for certain they're going to win. But you have a look in your bank account. How much cash can I free up to put on it for the weekend, for the winner? I'm not condoning betting. But so often in our Christian lives, it's a bit like saying, well, I'll put a fiver on Jesus, but I'll also hedge my bets and put a fiver on something else as well and just spread my bets around. But my friend, maybe if you challenge, you'll say, I'll put a tenner on Jesus. But the outcome isn't in doubt. God has delivered his final word. Jesus has sat down at the right hand of the Father. Nothing is in doubt. So why are we hesitant to put everything in Jesus' hands and trust them there? This is no gamble. This is a dead cert. We know what the outcome will be. God's final word. Not the headmaster that you fear, inspires fear and makes you hide away. But this is the one who came in love, who stooped to give himself at the cross. The one who came to our level, as it were, who holds everything in his hands and holds your circumstances for the year ahead. What will 2025 bring? Who knows? But we do know the one who does. God's final word, the one who holds all things in his hand and will take us through the new year. So God's final word. But secondly, we see that God's final word is enacted in person. And so we're looking from verse 4 to the end of the chapter. God's final word is enacted in person. So what's all this stuff about angels? And I may be wrong, but I don't think anybody here is going to wake up on Monday morning worrying about angels. You're thinking, what is this about angels that I need to get hold of? I doubt it. So why is it here? We all roll off the pat answer, well, it's because Jesus is greater than the angels. Just can be told he's greater than Moses and greater than Joshua. And yes, but why? Why does it say something about angels? Well, it's most likely it's because there was a belief that the Old Testament law had been delivered through angels. So you glance over to chapter 2 and verse 2. He says, for since the message spoken through angels was binding, and so on. Whether that was actually what happened in the Old Testament or not is open to some debate. But certainly whether it was or not, that was what they believed. The law had been delivered through angels. And it created an intrigue. There was something slightly mystical about it. Angel, how interesting. That's fascinating. It added something to the grandeur. You remember the occasion of the giving of the law? The mountains trembling, the smoke and fire on top of the mountain, thunder and lightning, the loud trumpet blast, and angels delivering the law. How can you top that? But the point that the writer is making here is that God's final word isn't delivered by some heavenly Amazon driver who drops off God's stone tablets at the Mount Sinai post office for Moses to come along and collect. Instead, God comes himself, not just to deliver a message, but to enact it. And so he says, after he provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, today I have become your father? Or again, I will be his father and he will be my son. And again, when he brings God's firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. And speaking of the angels, he says, he makes his angels spirits and his servants flames of fire. But about the Son, he says, your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. So the one who holds the cosmos in his hands comes to this earth as a helpless baby. He sustains all things, and yet he must be sustained by his mother. And yet, according to verse 6, as he comes, all God's angels worship him. And so Luke tells us in his gospel account that the skies above Bethlehem were filled with angels worshipping God, where it says, suddenly the angel was joined by a vast host of others, the armies of heaven, praising God. He has come to enact God's final word, and all heaven watches on and holds its breath. But he will then enact God's plan through a sinless life and a sacrificial death. And so verses 8 and 9 particularly emphasize that he will be rewarded for his love of righteousness and justice. It says, you've loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has set you above your companions. Here was that perfect life, that perfect life lived in the fear of God. And that perfect life is to be offered at the cross. So in verse 3, at the center of God's final word, he says those few words after he had provided purification for sins. He enacts that final word as he offered his perfect life at the cross. You see, angels simply delivered a message at best, but here the messenger is the message. It was through his life, his death, and his resurrection that he delivers God's final word. He is the message, and without him, everything is just empty, pointless ritual. The message is a message of reconciliation. Imagine you've fallen out with someone, maybe a family member. It's not too difficult, is it, to imagine? But imagine it's got bitter and it's got acrimonious. And the person that you've fallen out with after a long time sends someone that you've never met before with a letter seeking reconciliation and setting out terms of how that could be possible. What do you think? What are you going to do? Or perhaps that person comes to you in person to seek reconciliation. It's easy to ignore the first. It's very hard to ignore the latter. But you see, this isn't an acrimonious spat where, if truth be told, both parties are at fault. In this case, you are 100% at fault. And this isn't about relationships with another fallible human. This is with the maker of heaven and earth, the one that verse 8 says, "Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever." The maker of heaven and earth stoops to send the one through everything had been made. He stoops to come as one of us. He stoops to win your heart and mine. But there's hints of something further here. God's final word is enacted by Jesus as the whole cosmos itself will be redeemed. You see that in verses 10 and 12. Why this reference to creation? "In the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will roll them up like a robe. Like a garment they will be changed. But you remain the same, and your years will never end." God will one day roll it all up, he says. Roll out the new and renew everything. You remember Adam's acts of disobedience as he takes the fruit in the garden? You think, what a little sin. He just took the fruit. What's the big deal? And yet the seed of every sin was in that act. What he did represented every sin that would come. And because of it, everything is now cursed. Adam, his offspring, you and me, and the whole world and the cosmos itself becomes fallen and broken and cursed. But by Jesus' obedience and his death on the cross, everything Adam did has been reversed. This is not just a personal slate wiped clean, and my personal account with God set right. That is the starting point. That's where each of us needs to begin. But you see, the curse itself is removed, and everything that fell with Adam is redeemed. So there's a hint here that through the cross, the world will never be the same again. And one day that will be realized. It'll be fully realized as Jesus returns in his glory. He says, you will roll them up, the whole creation, you'll roll them up like a robe, like a garment they will be changed. But you remain the same, and your years will never end. He will sweep out the old. He will renew everything with a new heavens and a new earth. And at the centre of it all is what? The centre of it all, says the writer of the Hebrews, is you and me. He says, are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation? If you're a Christian, that's you this morning. Angels, the supporting cast, he says, are sent to serve you and me. You see, you are the object of God's love. You are the reason for God's final word. You are the reason why Jesus came. This morning, if you're a Christian, you are loved more than you can possibly imagine. Don't look at your circumstances and judge God's love through them. Look to the cross, look to what was done there, and judge God's love through that. So God's final word, enacted in person. But thirdly, the writer says, we need to take heed. I'm looking at the first 4 verses of chapter 2, where it says, we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. For since the message spoken through angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? Drifting. We've all seen it happen. And we've all realised if certain situations, if you don't pay attention, you drift. So maybe you've been on a boat with no anchor and watched it drift. Or maybe on the beach in an inflatable and realised that you're drifting out a long way. The book of Hebrews is peppered with warnings. It's not saying that your salvation hangs in the balance. Some people worry as they read Hebrews that that's what he's suggesting. All he's doing is simply looking at the alternative. People are tempted to give up. He's saying, well, just stop for a minute, look at the alternative, because there is an alternative, my friend. And he says effectively, you choose that, what then? How then shall we escape, he says, if we ignore so great a salvation? But how do we reject God's final word? How do we say to God, I've heard your final word and I'm not interested? Well, interestingly, the writer uses the word ignore and literally has the idea of not taking care of something. So it's not as if we openly reject God's message. That's it. I've had it. You can stuff it. I'm out of here. I'm not coming back. It's far more subtle. We just don't take care of it, he says. We don't value it enough to do something with it and to hold on to it. See, drifting, the danger of drifting is you don't realise that it's happening. You know, that landmark was once there, but now it's kind of over there when we drifted. You didn't realise it just happens. And maybe this morning you're sympathetic, you're listening, but you let conviction go and it drifts by. And my friend, as you do, so the day of grace drifts by with it. You must say to yourself, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? Maybe you believed in Christ, but other things become more important. You know, family, hobbies, work, whatever it might be. Things that all in themselves are good and legitimate and right, but they become more important and they crowd out spiritual things. And you skip church now and again, and gradually faith dwindles until it becomes just that faint flicker about to go out. We must pay the most careful attention, therefore, says the writer. We must value Christ above other things. We must look to things that are eternal rather than just the here and now. And maybe this morning all is just ritual and running in church hamster wheels and turning up at the meetings, hoping that somehow God's going to be impressed by it all. Well, essentially that's doing what the right people in Hebrews were in danger of doing, going back into just the rituals of religion and no more. Interestingly, the writer's keen to point out that if you drift, it's not for want of a lack of evidence. It's not just that the message isn't reliable. God didn't just turn up in person, but he made sure that you could be quite clear this isn't the stuff of myth and legend. It's the record of eyewitnesses, according to verse 3. This salvation, first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him, was passed on by those who were there, those who saw, those who heard. And then he says, God also testified to it by signs, wonders, and various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit. We saw a while back in John's Gospel how John calls them signs. He says that these things were like a signpost pointing to Jesus and saying, listen to him, this is true, this is reliable. And so with the apostles, it continued. The miracles that followed confirmed the message. This was no sect appearing out of some wacky place. This was true. And so this morning, you can't just shrug your shoulders and say, oh yeah, that's very interesting, thank you, yes. What's for lunch? We must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away, he says. Why? For he says, if every disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? So the take-home message for 2025. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Maybe you're facing discouragement, but the message is to stay in the race, to see what it's about. We need to resist the temptations to let it all fade away. We need to resist the discouragements and keep our eyes focused ahead. Fixing our eyes, says the writer on Hebrews. We fix our eyes on Jesus when you know that he is everything we can ever need. I don't have to pretend. I don't have to hide away. I don't have to prove anything to God or to myself. Jesus is everything. He has enacted God's final word. I am safe in his hands, whatever the year ahead brings. And we fix our eyes knowing that as he has enacted that final plan, so he will bring it to pass in history. And so whatever 2025 brings, everything is in his hands until one day he wraps it all up like a garment and makes all things new.